In the heart of London, where ambition rules and dreams collide, a millionaire's life takes a turn he never expected. A chance encounter with a young girl on a quiet street sparks a journey of transformation, one that will leave a lasting impact. This story proves that even in the city of power, the smallest voices can change everything.
The sharp chill of a London evening swept through the lively streets of Camden, where Edward Graham, a renowned millionaire, strolled without purpose, dressed in a sleek, tailored coat and polished shoes. He looked every bit the picture of success. Yet, his steps were heavy, and his mind wandered to places that no amount of wealth could reach. The world knew him as a man who had everything, but within, Edward felt hollow, trapped in a gilded cage of his own making. As he walked, the chatter of diners and cafes and the rhythm of street performers barely registered in his mind. Then, the sound of laughter broke through the fog of his thoughts. It wasn't the loud cheer of adults in revelry. It was the carefree, unrestrained giggle of a child. Intrigued, Edward glanced toward the sound and spotted a little girl playing alone with a battered ball in a quiet corner. Her coat was threadbare, and her boots scuffed, but she exuded a warmth that stood in stark contrast to the frigid air. Edward stopped, watching as she kicked the ball against a wall, her ponytail bobbing with each movement. Then, with a poorly aimed kick, the ball rolled toward him, coming to rest at his feet. Edward bent down to pick it up, meeting the gaze of the girl as she ran to retrieve it. Her bright, inquisitive eyes seemed to pierce right through him. "Thanks, mister," she said with a smile, hugging the ball tightly. "You're welcome," Edward replied, surprised at the softness in his own voice. For a moment, he hesitated, feeling an inexplicable pull to engage further. "What's your name?" he asked. "Amelia," she answered simply, tilting her head as though sizing him up. "What's yours?" "Edward," he said, almost chuckling at her boldness. "Are you playing out here all alone?" Before Amelia could answer, a woman appeared, walking briskly toward them. Her coat was patched, and her eyes carried the weariness of someone accustomed to life's struggles. She gave Edward a cautious glance before addressing the girl. "Amelia, I told you not to go far," she said firmly, placing a hand on her shoulder. Then, turning to Edward, she added, "Thank you for helping." Edward nodded, sensing her protective demeanor. "It's no trouble." But Amelia was unbothered by her mother's tension. Looking up at Edward, she spoke with a candor that caught him off guard. "You look sad," she said matter-of-factly, "even though you're dressed really fancy." Her mother's face flushed with embarrassment. "Amelia, don't say that." Edward, however, wasn't offended. In fact, he felt oddly seen. "It's all right," he said, almost smiling. "Sometimes children notice things adults don't." As her mother tried to guide her away, Amelia paused and turned back, her voice ringing clear in the cold air. "If you want to stop being sad, you should help someone who needs it," she said, her tone as serious as if she were sharing a great secret. "That's what my gran always says. It works." Before Edward could respond, the two disappeared into the crowd, leaving him standing alone with her words swirling in his mind. "Help someone who needs it." The phrase clung to him like the chill of the night, refusing to fade. Back in his penthouse apartment overlooking the Thames, Edward sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows. The lights of London sparkled against the inky river below, a city full of ambition and noise. Yet, for the first time, the sight brought him no comfort. His mind was elsewhere, on Amelia and her unexpected wisdom. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, but the taste felt hollow. Across the room, his leather-bound notebook caught his eye. Normally reserved for business plans and strategies, it now seemed to invite something different. Taking a pen, Edward opened it to a blank page and wrote, in deliberate strokes, "Tomorrow, I will begin." As the clock struck midnight, He closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair. Though he didn't know what form it would take, he felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar, purpose, and perhaps, just perhaps, the start of something meaningful. The morning sun spilled over London, casting a golden glow on the streets below Edward's penthouse. He stood by the window, coffee in hand, his mind unusually alert for someone who typically began the day with autopilot efficiency. Today was different. Amelia's words lingered in his thoughts. Help someone who needs it. Edward wasn't sure what that meant for a man like him. His life revolved around acquisitions and profits, not altruism. Yet, as he gazed at the bustling city, he felt a nagging compulsion to step outside his world of luxury and into the unknown. By mid-morning, Edward found himself walking through Camden once more. This time, however, his steps were purposeful. He retraced the path where he had met Amelia, scanning the streets and alleyways. Though he wasn't entirely sure what he was searching for, he knew he needed to start somewhere. As he wandered, the aroma of freshly baked bread drew him toward a small bakery tucked between towering brick buildings. The sign above the door read, "The Hearth, Fresh Bakes and Hope." Intrigued by the unusual tagline, Edward stepped inside. The warm interior contrasted sharply with the brisk air outside. Shelves were lined with loaves of bread, pastries, and jars of jam. Behind the counter, a cheerful woman greeted him. Her apron was dusted with flour, and her smile seemed genuine. "Good morning. What can I get for you?" she asked. Edward hesitated. He hadn't come for bread, but something about the place felt inviting. "Actually," he began, "I was just curious about your sign. Fresh Bakes and Hope. What does that mean?" The woman's smile widened. "We're more than just a bakery. We run a program to help struggling families. For every loaf sold, we donate another to someone in need. It's a small way to give back." Edward nodded thoughtfully. "And does it work? Do people respond to that?" "Oh, absolutely," she said. "Sometimes the simplest acts of kindness make the biggest difference." Her words resonated with him. He bought a loaf, though he had no intention of eating it, and left the bakery with a sense of clarity. Maybe helping didn't have to be grandiose or complicated. Maybe it started with small, intentional actions. His next stop was an unfamiliar part of town. Edward ventured into East London, an area he'd only ever heard about in news reports or during charity galas. The streets here were different, busier, rougher, alive with stories that weren't always told. He noticed a community center with faded paint but a steady stream of people going in and out. A handwritten sign on the door read, "Volunteers needed, all skills welcome." Edward paused. His mind raced with doubts. A place like this was far removed from the boardrooms and five-star restaurants he frequented. But the words on the sign tugged at him, and before he could talk himself out of it, he walked inside. The center was a hive of activity. Children played in one corner, while volunteers sorted donations in another. A man with a clipboard approached Edward, his expression a mix of curiosity and mild skepticism. "Can I help you?" the man asked. "I saw the sign outside," Edward said, glancing around. "I was wondering how I could get involved." The man raised an eyebrow. Edward's tailored coat and polished demeanor clearly didn't match the usual profile of their volunteers. "Are you sure? It's not exactly glamorous work." "I'm not here for glamour," Edward replied firmly. "I want to help." The man nodded slowly. "All right then. I'm Henry, the coordinator here. Let's see where we can use you." Henry led Edward to a storage room where clothes, food, and toys were stacked haphazardly. "Start by sorting these," he said. "Food on one side, clothing on the other. Toys go into those bins." It was mundane, repetitive work, far removed from the dynamic pace of Edward's usual life. But as he folded sweaters and checked expiration dates on cans, he found a surprising sense of satisfaction. The hours passed quickly, and by the end of the afternoon, he'd cleared and organized most of the room. Before leaving, Edward noticed a bulletin board filled with handwritten notes. Some were thank you messages from families who had been helped by the center. Others were requests, jobs needed, childcare offered, community events. One note caught his eye. It was written in a child's uneven handwriting. Thank you for helping my mom. You made her smile again. Katie. Edward stared at the note, his chest tightening. It reminded him of Amelia and the simple wisdom she'd shared. Perhaps this was what she meant, helping someone so they could smile again. The next day, Edward returned to the community center. This time, he came prepared. He had spent the night brainstorming ways to contribute beyond sorting donations. Using his skills as a businessman, he drafted a plan to connect the center with local businesses for sponsorships and funding. When he presented the idea to Henry, the coordinator looked genuinely impressed. I've seen a lot of people come through these doors, Henry said, but I've never met someone like you. Why are you doing this? Edward hesitated, unsure how to articulate what he felt. I guess I realized I've been looking for something real, and I think this is it. Henry nodded. Well, whatever brought you here, I'm glad it did. Your help could really make a difference. As the days turned into weeks, Edward became a regular fixture at the center. He worked alongside the volunteers, built connections with local businesses, and even spent time with the families who visited. Slowly, he began to understand the complexities of their lives, the struggles they faced, and the resilience they showed. One evening, as Edward was leaving the center, he saw a familiar figure. It was Amelia, standing with her mother near the entrance. She spotted him and waved enthusiastically. Mr. Edward, she called, running toward him. What are you doing here? Edward smiled, crouching to meet her at eye level. I could ask you the same thing. Do you come here often? Mom and I come for the after-school program, Amelia said proudly. It's really fun. They have painting and stories. Her mother approached, smiling shyly. We didn't expect to see you here. It's a small world, Edward replied. I'm volunteering here now. Amelia grinned. See, I told you helping people would make you happy. Edward chuckled, ruffling her hair. You were right, Amelia. You were absolutely right. As he watched Amelia and her mother walk away, Edward felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had taken the first steps toward something meaningful, and he knew there was more work to be done. But for the first time in years, he felt a spark of joy, a spark ignited by the wisdom of a little girl who saw the world with open eyes. Edward woke earlier than usual, his mind buzzing with ideas. Volunteering at the community center had opened his eyes to a world he had long ignored. The connections he had begun to form with people like Henry, the volunteers, and even Amelia and her mother, sparked something new in him. It wasn't just about helping. It was about creating something lasting. He wanted to do more than patch holes. He wanted to build bridges. That morning, Edward arrived at the community center with purpose. Henry greeted him with a nod, already accustomed to seeing the polished businessman roll up his sleeves to sort clothes or restock shelves. Morning, Edward, Henry said. We've got a busy day ahead. A shipment of donated goods just arrived. I'll get to it, Edward replied, but his mind was elsewhere. He had spent the previous evening sketching out an idea for a broader initiative, a way to connect local businesses with the center to create a sustainable support network. He was eager to pitch the concept to Henry. As Edward moved boxes of canned goods into the storage room, he found the perfect opportunity to bring it up. Henry, he began, stacking a box onto a shelf. I've been thinking. The center relies heavily on donations, right? Henry raised an eyebrow. That's an understatement. We're always scrambling to get enough. Well, Edward said, his tone careful but enthusiastic. What if we created partnerships with local businesses? We could secure regular funding or resources instead of waiting for one-off donations. Henry paused, clearly intrigued. Go on. I've already made a list of businesses in the area that might be interested. Restaurants, retail shops, even gyms. I can use my connections to set up meetings and show them how supporting the center benefits everyone. Henry crossed his arms, considering the idea. It's ambitious, he admitted. But if anyone can pull it off, it's you. All right, let's give it a shot. Buoyed by Henry's approval, Edward spent the rest of the day drafting proposals. The plan wasn't just about securing donations. It was about building relationships. He envisioned a network where businesses would not only contribute money, but also services, like job opportunities for the families who visited the center or workshops to teach new skills. That evening, Edward headed to his first meeting with a local business owner, a woman named Rachel who ran a successful cafe nearby. The cafe, nestled in a cozy corner of East London, was bustling with customers when Edward arrived. Rachel greeted him warmly and led him to a quiet table. I'm curious, Rachel said as they sat down. You're clearly not someone who needs to be doing this. So why are you here? Edward smiled, appreciating her directness. Because I've realized that success feels hollow if it doesn't help others. I want to make a difference, and I think your cafe could be part of that. He explained his vision for the community center, emphasizing how local businesses could play a role in creating a stronger, more connected neighborhood. Rachel listened intently, nodding at times and asking thoughtful questions. By the end of their meeting, she was on board. We can start small, Rachel said. I'll donate food for your programs, and maybe we can host a fundraiser here. Edward shook her hand, grateful for her enthusiasm. It was a small victory, but it gave him the momentum he needed to approach other businesses. Over the next week, Edward met with shop owners, gym managers, and even a local florist. His pitch was always the same, a partnership that benefited both the community and the businesses themselves. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People wanted to help. They just needed someone to show them how. One evening, as Edward was preparing for another meeting, he received a call from Henry. You've got to come down to the center, Henry said, his voice urgent. We've got a situation. Edward arrived to find the usually bustling community center unusually quiet. Families huddled in small groups, their faces etched with concern. Henry pulled him aside to explain. One of the families we help, single mom. 2 kids, they're being evicted. She's been behind on rent for months, and there's nowhere for them to go. Edward felt a pang in his chest. The woman, Sarah, was someone he had met during his first week at the center. Her youngest, a boy of 6, had drawn him a picture as a thank you for the toys he'd sorted. What can we do? Edward asked. Henry shook his head. We don't have the resources to help with something like this. All we can do is refer her to a shelter, but they're already overcrowded. Edward glanced around the room, taking in the somber atmosphere. This wasn't just about one family. It was about a system that left people behind. For the first time, he felt the weight of the challenge he had taken on. I'll handle it, Edward said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. He spent the next few hours making calls. Using every connection he had, he managed to secure temporary housing for Sarah and her children in a nearby motel. It was a stopgap solution, but it bought them time to explore other options. When Edward returned to the center to share the news, Sarah hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered. I didn't know what we were going to do. Edward nodded, his heart heavy yet determined. This was a reminder that the work he was doing wasn't just about ideas or plans. It was about real lives, real struggles, and real hope. Later that night, as he sat in his apartment overlooking the city, Edward reflected on the day. His successes in business had always been measured in profits and accolades, but this was different. The satisfaction he felt was deeper, more meaningful. He opened his notebook and wrote a single line. Hope isn't just given, it's built. The next day, Edward arrived at the center with renewed purpose. He met with Henry and the rest of the staff to discuss creating an emergency fund specifically for situations like Sarah's. He also reached out to his new business partners, asking them to contribute to the fund. Within days, the fund was established, and the center had a safety net for future crises. As the weeks went on, the partnerships Edward had forged began to bear fruit. Businesses donated not just money, but also time and expertise. A local gym offered free fitness classes for families, and a tech company set up a workshop to teach job skills. Through it all, Edward stayed closely involved. He spent his days at the center, working alongside volunteers and listening to the families who came through its doors. He learned their names, their stories, their dreams, and in return, they began to trust him. Not as a wealthy benefactor, but as someone who genuinely cared. One evening, as Edward was leaving the center, he spotted Amelia sitting on the steps, sketching in a notebook. Her mother stood nearby, chatting with another parent. "What are you drawing?" Edward asked, sitting beside her. Amelia held up the notebook. It was a picture of the community center, with people of all shapes and sizes walking in and out. Above it, she had written in big, bold letters, "A place where everyone belongs." Edward smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "That's exactly what we're building, Amelia." She grinned. "Told you helping people would make you happy." Edward laughed softly. "Yes, you did." As he walked home that night, Edward felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He was no longer searching for meaning. It was right here, in the bridges he was building and the lives he was helping to change. The community center buzzed with life as families gathered for a new weekly tradition, the neighborhood dinner. It was a simple concept. Everyone brought a dish to share, but it had become a cornerstone of the growing connections between the families and volunteers. Edward stood near the entrance, watching the lively crowd. Children darted between tables, their laughter echoing through the room, while adults chatted over plates of food. Henry approached with a grin. "You know, when you first showed up in that fancy coat, I didn't think you'd stick around. But now, you're practically running the place." Edward chuckled. "I wouldn't go that far, but I'll take the compliment." The neighborhood dinner was more than just a meal. It was a symbol of the change Edward had helped inspire. The partnerships he had established were thriving, providing resources that went beyond the basic needs of food and clothing. Families were beginning to see the community center as a place where they could build their futures, not just survive. As Edward circulated the room, he noticed Sarah, the mother he'd helped secure temporary housing, sitting at a table with her children. Her youngest waved enthusiastically, holding up a drawing he had made of their new apartment. It was small and modest, but it was theirs, and the pride in Sarah's face was unmistakable. Edward walked over to her table. "How's everything going, Sarah?" She smiled warmly. "Better than I could have imagined. The kids are settling in, and I've started a part-time job thanks to the connections Henry helped me make." "I can't thank you enough. You've done the hard work," Edward replied. "I'm just glad to see you thriving." Her gratitude humbled him. It reminded him that small gestures could create ripples of change, and those ripples were beginning to transform not just lives, but the entire community. As the evening wore on, Henry called for everyone's attention. Standing near the mural that adorned the far wall, a vibrant depiction of unity painted by local children, he raised his glass. "Tonight, we celebrate not just a meal but the strength of this community," he said. "We've come a long way, and it's thanks to every one of you. Let's keep building something we can all be proud of." The room erupted in applause. Edward felt a swell of pride, but also a quiet determination. He knew there was still much to do. The next morning, Edward met with Rachel, the cafe owner, who had been one of his first business partners. They sat in the cozy corner of her cafe, discussing plans for an upcoming fundraiser. "I've been thinking," Rachel said, stirring her tea. "What if we take the fundraiser a step further? Instead of just raising money, we could host a job fair, connect people from the center with local businesses looking to hire." Edward's eyes lit up. "That's a fantastic idea. It's exactly the kind of sustainable change we need to focus on." They spent the next hour brainstorming details, from inviting businesses to offering resume workshops and interview coaching. By the time Edward left, the plan was already taking shape. The fundraiser job fair quickly became the talk of the neighborhood. Flyers were distributed, and businesses lined up to participate, eager to be part of the initiative. On the day of the event, the community center was unrecognizable. Tables were set up with representatives from local companies, and a corner of the room was dedicated to workshops run by volunteers. Edward arrived early to oversee the preparations. As the first attendees trickled in, he couldn't help but feel a mix of nerves and excitement. This was more than an event. It was a chance to show the community what was possible. Amelia and her mother were among the first to arrive. Amelia ran up to Edward, clutching her sketchbook. "Mr. Edward, I made something for the job fair," she exclaimed, holding up a poster she had drawn. It featured colorful figures holding hands under the words, "Together we grow." Edward smiled. "It's perfect, Amelia. Let's hang it up where everyone can see." The job fair exceeded everyone's expectations. By the end of the day, several attendees had scheduled interviews, and many more left feeling hopeful about new opportunities. Edward watched as families mingled with business owners, their conversations filled with optimism. For the first time, he felt that the bridge he had envisioned was truly coming to life. As the event wound down, Rachel approached Edward with a grin. "You've done something remarkable here. This isn't just a community center anymore. It's a launch pad." Edward nodded, though his mind was already racing with ideas for what could come next. The success of the job fair confirmed what he had suspected. There was potential to expand this model beyond East London. That evening, Edward met with Henry to discuss the future. They sat in the now-empty community center, the echoes of the day's laughter still lingering in the air. "We've proven that this works," Edward said. "The partnerships, the events, it's all creating real change. But I keep thinking, why stop here? What if we could replicate this in other neighborhoods?" Henry leaned back in his chair, considering the idea. "It's ambitious, but you've already shown it's possible. The question is, how do we scale it without losing what makes it special?" Edward appreciated Henry's pragmatism. "It has to remain community-driven," he said. "Every neighborhood is different, and the people living there need to shape the programs. We can provide the framework, but the heart has to come from them." Henry nodded. "I like it. Let's start small, maybe 1 or 2 more centers, and see how it goes." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning. Edward and Henry identified 2 neighborhoods where they could pilot the expansion. They reached out to local leaders, businesses, and residents, ensuring that the new centers would be built with the same principles of collaboration and empowerment. Meanwhile, back in East London, the original center continued to thrive. Families like Sarah's were not just surviving but beginning to flourish. The emergency fund Edward had established proved invaluable, providing support during unexpected crises. Workshops and events became regular fixtures, each one strengthening the bonds within the community. One evening, as Edward was leaving the center, Amelia stopped him on the steps. She held a new drawing, this one of a tree with deep roots and sprawling branches. Each branch was labeled with a word: hope, community, growth, love. "It's for you," she said, handing him the drawing. "To remind you of what we're building." Edward felt a lump in his throat as he looked at the drawing. "Thank you, Amelia. I'll treasure it." As he walked home, The drawing tucked safely under his arm, Edward reflected on how far they had come. The seeds of change they had planted were beginning to grow, not just in East London, but with the potential to spread even further. And for the first time in his life, Edward felt a deep, abiding sense of purpose. Edward stood at the edge of a vacant lot in Southwark, a neighborhood with a history as rich as its struggles. Beside him, Henry flipped through the plans for what would soon become the second community center under their initiative. The site had once housed an old textile factory, now reduced to rubble and weeds, but Edward could already envision what it would become, a hub of hope and opportunity. "It's going to take a lot to get this off the ground," Henry said, surveying the area. "But if anyone can pull it off, it's you." Edward smiled faintly. "We pulled it off in Camden. We can do it here, too." The two had spent weeks meeting with local residents, listening to their concerns and ideas. The response had been overwhelmingly positive. People were eager for change, but many were skeptical. They had seen too many promises go unfulfilled, too many well-meaning projects fail to address the root causes of their challenges. Edward knew that trust had to be earned. That meant involving the community in every step of the process. They set up weekly meetings in a borrowed church hall, inviting residents to share their input on everything from the design of the center to the programs it would offer. Each meeting brought new faces, new stories, and new insights. One evening, Edward stayed after a meeting to speak with a woman named Angela, who had been one of the most vocal participants. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" she asked, her tone laced with both curiosity and doubt. "I am," Edward replied. "But I know words don't mean much without action." Angela crossed her arms, studying him. "You're not from here. Why do you care so much?" Edward hesitated, then said, "Because I've realized that my success means nothing if it doesn't help others. I care because I've seen what happens when people lose hope, and I believe we can change that together." Angela nodded slowly. "All right, Mr. Graham. Let's see what you can do." With Angela's support, momentum began to build. She became a key liaison between Edward's team and the Southwark community, helping to bridge the gap between two worlds that rarely intersected. Her presence lent credibility to the project, and her no-nonsense approach kept everyone focused on the goal. As construction on the new center began, Edward split his time between Southwark and Camden. The original center remained a thriving hub, thanks in large part to the leadership of Henry and the growing network of volunteers. Programs like the job fair had become regular events, drawing participants from across the city. One afternoon, Edward returned to Camden to check in on an art workshop being run by Rachel. The room was filled with children of all ages, their hands smeared with paint as they created colorful masterpieces. At the center of it all was Amelia, her ponytail bouncing as she worked on a large canvas. "Mr. Edward," she called when she saw him. "Come look at what we're making." Edward walked over, his curiosity piqued. Amelia had painted a sprawling cityscape, each building adorned with words like hope, love, and community. "It's beautiful, Amelia," he said. "You've captured everything we're trying to build." Amelia beamed. "Do you think we could hang it in the new center when it's done?" Edward nodded. "I think that's a great idea." As the weeks turned into months, the Southwark Center began to take shape. What had once been a derelict lot was now a vibrant space, with bright murals, open classrooms, and a large communal area. Local businesses had donated supplies and services, and residents had pitched in to paint walls and assemble furniture. The sense of ownership was palpable. On the day of the grand opening, the center buzzed with activity. Families explored the space. Children laughed as they played in the new playground, and volunteers handed out information about upcoming programs. Edward stood near the entrance, watching the scene unfold. It was a moment he had dreamed of, but seeing it come to life was something else entirely. Angela approached him, a rare smile on her usually stern face. "You did good, Graham," she said. "This place, it's something special." "We did good," Edward corrected. "This wouldn't have happened without you and everyone here." As the sun set on the opening day, Edward gathered the crowd in the communal area to say a few words. Standing under a banner that read, "Together we build," he felt a wave of emotion. "This center is more than a building," he began. "It's a testament to what we can achieve when we work together. It's a place where dreams can take root, where challenges can be faced, and where no one has to feel alone. Thank you for believing in this vision and making it a reality." The applause that followed was thunderous. As Edward stepped down, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Turning, he saw Amelia, holding a familiar canvas. "Can we hang it now?" she asked. Edward smiled. "Let's do it." Together, they found a spot near the entrance for Amelia's cityscape. As they secured it to the wall, Edward realized how much this journey had transformed him. What had started as a vague sense of purpose had grown into a mission, one that was far from over. That night, as Edward walked through the quiet streets of Southwark, he thought about the road ahead. 2 centers were a start, but there were countless neighborhoods, countless stories waiting to be heard. The work was daunting, but for the first time in his life, Edward felt ready to face it. He pulled out his notebook and wrote a single line. "This is only the beginning." The first few weeks after the Southwark Center's grand opening were filled with optimism and progress. Programs were running smoothly, families were engaging with one another, and Edward felt a sense of accomplishment every time he visited. However, as with any ambitious project, the honeymoon phase was short-lived. Edward had just finished a meeting with Henry at the Camden Center when his phone buzzed with a call from Angela. Her voice, usually firm and confident, was laced with frustration. "We've got a problem, Graham," she said. "There's been some tension at the Southwark Center. You need to come down." Edward didn't hesitate. He left Camden immediately, his mind racing with possibilities. By the time he arrived at Southwark, Angela was waiting for him near the entrance, arms crossed and her expression stormy. "What's going on?" Edward asked. Angela gestured toward a group of parents gathered in the communal area, their voices raised in heated discussion. "Some of the families feel like they're being left out," she explained. "They think the programs are favoring certain groups over others." Edward frowned. "That's not true. We've been careful to make everything accessible." Angela nodded. "I know that, and you know that. But perception matters, Edward. If people feel excluded, it doesn't matter what the facts are." Edward approached the group cautiously. The conversation quieted as the parents noticed him, their expressions ranging from frustration to unease. He recognized some of them from the community meetings held before the center opened. People who had initially been enthusiastic about the project. "What's going on here?" Edward asked, his tone calm but firm. One woman, a mother of 3 named Nadia, stepped forward. "We're grateful for everything this center offers," she began. "But some of us feel like our voices aren't being heard anymore. The job training program, for example, it's great, but it's only during hours when some of us are working, and the childcare slots fill up too quickly." Edward listened intently, nodding as she spoke. Others chimed in, echoing her concerns. It became clear that the issue wasn't favoritism, but a lack of communication and coordination. "I hear you," Edward said when they had finished. "And you're right. We need to do better. This center belongs to all of you, and your input is critical. Let's set up a meeting this week to address these concerns and find solutions together." The group seemed mollified, though their wariness hadn't entirely dissipated. As they dispersed, Angela walked up beside Edward. "That could have gone worse," she said, "but you've got your work cut out for you." Edward nodded. "We'll fix this. We have to." The following evening, Edward held a town hall-style meeting at the center. Dozens of families attended, along with volunteers and staff. Edward began by addressing the concerns raised the previous day. "I want to start by apologizing," he said. "If any of you feel unheard or excluded, that's on me. This center was built to serve everyone, and if it's not doing that, we need to fix it." He opened the floor to suggestions, taking careful notes as parents and volunteers offered ideas. Some proposed extending program hours to accommodate different schedules. Others suggested creating a rotation system for childcare to ensure fair access. Angela, ever the pragmatist, volunteered to oversee the implementation of the new changes. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere had shifted. The tension was still there, but it had been tempered by a renewed sense of collaboration. As the room cleared out, Nadia approached Edward. "Thank you for listening," she said. "It means a lot." Edward smiled. "Thank you for speaking up. We're in this together." Over the next few weeks, the changes were implemented. The job training program added evening sessions, and a new online system was introduced for childcare sign-ups. Slowly but surely, the community's trust began to rebuild. But just as one storm passed, another loomed on the horizon. One afternoon, Edward received a call from Rachel. She had been instrumental in supporting both centers, organizing fundraisers and connecting them with local businesses. Her voice, usually full of warmth, was strained. "Edward, we've got a serious problem," she said. "One of the companies that pledged funding for Camden is pulling out." Edward's stomach sank. The company in question was one of their largest donors, responsible for covering a significant portion of the center's operational costs. "Why?" he asked. "They're downsizing," Rachel explained. "Their CEO said they have to cut non-essential spending, and apparently, that includes us." Edward exhaled sharply. Losing that funding would create a massive gap in the budget, one that wouldn't be easy to fill. "I'll handle it," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure how. That evening, Edward met with Henry to discuss the situation. The two sat in the now familiar meeting room at the Camden Center, the weight of the challenge hanging heavily between them. "We've got some reserves," Henry said, "but not enough to cover this long term. We need to find a new sponsor, and fast." Edward nodded. "I'll start reaching out to contacts tomorrow. In the meantime, we need to tighten the budget without cutting services." Over the next few days, Edward threw himself into finding a solution. He met with potential sponsors, pitched the center's mission to business leaders, and even reached out to philanthropic organizations. Each meeting brought new challenges, but Edward refused to give up. One evening, as Edward was leaving yet another meeting, his phone buzzed. It was Amelia. "Hi, Mr. Edward," she said cheerfully. "Mom and I were wondering if you're coming to the art show tomorrow." Edward had nearly forgotten about the event, a showcase of the children's artwork at the Camden Center. He smiled despite his exhaustion. "Of course I'll be there," he said. The next day, Edward arrived at the center to find it transformed. Paintings and drawings lined the walls, each one bursting with creativity and hope. Amelia's cityscape had a place of honor near the entrance, alongside a plaque that read, "A place where everyone belongs." As Edward walked through the exhibit, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The centers weren't just buildings, they were lifelines, places where people could find hope and community. He couldn't let them falter. Toward the end of the evening, Rachel pulled him aside. "I've been talking to some of the attendees," she said. "There are a few who might be interested in supporting the centers. Let's set up meetings next week." Edward nodded, gratitude washing over him. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he wasn't walking it alone. That night, as he sat in his apartment, Edward opened his notebook and wrote, "Every storm is an opportunity to grow stronger." The funding crisis had brought a new intensity to Edward's mission. While the Camden and Southwark centers remained functional, every passing day tightened the financial strain. Yet, amidst the stress, something remarkable was happening. The community itself was stepping up in ways Edward hadn't anticipated. At the Camden Center, Henry had rallied volunteers to organize a fundraising event. It wasn't a typical charity gala, but a grassroots effort, one that showcased the talents and creativity of the families and volunteers who called the center their second home. The event, dubbed the Together We Build Fair, promised an evening of art, food, and performances, with all proceeds going toward keeping the centers afloat. Edward arrived early on the day of the fair to help with preparations. The communal area was a flurry of activity. Tables were being decorated, stalls set up, and children rehearsing for a small play they had written themselves. "Mr. Edward." Amelia's familiar voice rang out as she darted toward him, holding a brightly painted sign. "Look what we made," she said, holding up a banner that read, "Hope Lives Here." Edward smiled, touched by the effort. "It's perfect, Amelia. Let's hang it right at the entrance." As the evening began, the fair quickly filled with visitors. Families, local business owners, and even people who had heard about the centers through word of mouth came to support the cause. The atmosphere was electric, laughter and music echoing through the halls. One of the highlights of the evening was an art auction featuring works created by the children. Amelia's cityscape was among the pieces, and Edward felt a swell of pride as he watched attendees admire her work. "She's got real talent," Rachel said, joining Edward near the auction table. "I wouldn't be surprised if we see her paintings in galleries one day." Edward nodded. "She's already inspired so many people here. She reminds me why this work matters." By the end of the night, the fair had raised a significant amount, enough to keep the Camden Center running for several more months. The success gave Edward and Henry breathing room, but they knew it was only a temporary solution. The next morning, Edward met with Rachel and Angela to discuss long-term strategies. They gathered in a cafe, their conversation fueled by strong coffee and a shared determination. "We can't rely solely on events like the fair," Rachel said. "They're great for community building, but they're not sustainable for funding." Angela, ever pragmatic, added, "We need to broaden our reach. There are plenty of organizations out there with deep pockets. The challenge is convincing them that what we're doing here is worth investing in." Edward nodded. "I've been thinking about that too. We need to tell our story, show the impact these centers have had. If we can get the right people to see that, I think we'll find the support we need." Over the next few weeks, Edward and his team worked tirelessly to create a compelling presentation. They compiled photos, testimonials from families, and data showing how the centers had improved lives. Amelia's artwork even made its way into the presentation, her vibrant cityscape serving as a symbol of hope and resilience. The first opportunity to present their case came at a networking event for philanthropic organizations. Edward, dressed sharply but feeling the weight of the stakes, stood before a room of potential donors and delivered his pitch. "These centers are more than just buildings," he said, his voice steady but passionate. "They're places where people find second chances, where children discover their potential, and where communities come together to create something greater than themselves. With your support, we can replicate this success in more neighborhoods, reaching even more people who need it." The room was silent for a moment, then erupted into applause. Several attendees approached Edward afterward, expressing interest in partnering with the initiative. It was a promising start, but Edward knew there was still a long way to go. Back at the centers, life continued to thrive. The success of the fair had sparked new ideas among the families and volunteers. They began organizing smaller events, potluck dinners, talent shows, and even a gardening project at the Southwark Center. Each activity brought people closer together, strengthening the bonds that made the centers unique. One afternoon, Edward visited the Southwark Center to check on the gardening project. He found Angela overseeing a group of children planting flowers in raised beds near the entrance. Amelia was among them, her hands covered in dirt as she carefully placed a seedling into the soil. "Looks like you've got quite the green thumb," Edward said, kneeling beside her. Amelia grinned. "We're planting flowers that will bloom in the spring. It's like we're making the future pretty." Edward chuckled. "That's a beautiful way to think about it." As he watched the children work, Edward felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The centers weren't just helping people survive, they were giving them the tools and confidence to thrive. But the challenges were far from over. Despite the positive response to his presentation, securing long-term funding was proving more difficult than Edward had hoped. Many organizations were hesitant to commit, citing budget constraints or competing priorities. One evening, as Edward sat in his apartment, reviewing a growing pile of rejection letters, he felt the familiar pang of doubt. Was he trying to do too much? Too fast? Was it possible to sustain this vision in the face of so many obstacles? His phone buzzed, raking his thoughts. It was a message from Rachel. "Check your email. You're going to want to see this." Edward opened his laptop and found an email from a large foundation he had pitched 2 weeks earlier. The subject line read, "Funding approval, congratulations." As he read the message, a wave of relief and excitement washed over him. The foundation had agreed to provide significant funding for both centers, as well as seed money to establish a third location. It was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. The next morning, Edward shared the news with Henry, Angela, and Rachel. The room erupted in cheers and laughter, the weight of the past months momentarily lifting. "This is huge," Henry said. "But you know what this means. We've got even more work to do." Edward nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "I wouldn't have it any other way." That evening, the Camden Center hosted a celebration to mark the milestone. Families, volunteers, and staff gathered to reflect on how far they had come and to look ahead to the future. As Edward stood among them, watching children play and parents laugh, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. Amelia approached him, her hands clasping a new drawing. It was a tree with sprawling branches, each one labeled with words like strength, hope, and community. At the base of the tree were small figures planting seeds. "It's for you," she said, "to remind you of what we're growing." Edward took the drawing, his chest tightening with emotion. "Thank you, Amelia. It's perfect." As the evening wound down, Edward stood outside the center, gazing up at the stars. The journey was far from over, but tonight, he allowed himself to savor the moment. Together, they had weathered the storm and emerged stronger. And as the centers continued to grow, so too did the hope that fueled them. The glow of the recent funding success had ignited a new energy within Edward and his team. With the immediate financial concerns behind them, their focus turned to expansion. The third community center was slated for Brixton, a neighborhood known for its vibrant culture, but also its struggles with gentrification and rising inequality. Edward saw this as an opportunity to create a bridge between the community's rich history and its potential for growth. The planning meetings for the Brixton Center were held in a local library, a space generously offered by the staff who supported the initiative. Angela, now a pivotal member of the team, facilitated the discussions with her characteristic no-nonsense attitude. "The key is listening," Angela reminded the group during their first meeting with Brixton residents. "We're not here to impose solutions. We're here to find out what this community wants and needs." Edward nodded, taking a seat among the residents. The library meeting room was filled with a mix of ages and backgrounds. Longtime locals who remembered Brixton's heyday, young parents seeking better opportunities for their children, and even a few teenagers who had come out of curiosity. A man named Peter, whose deep voice carried the weight of years spent fighting for community causes, spoke first. "What worries me is that this will just be another project that comes and goes," he said. We've seen it before. Good intentions that fizzle out when the funding dries up. Edward leaned forward. I understand your concern, Peter. And you're right to be cautious. That's why we're building these centers with the community. Not for the community. You'll shape the programs, manage the operations, and decide the future. We're just providing the tools and resources to make it happen. Peter studied Edward for a moment, then gave a small nod. All right, let's see what you've got. The meeting continued with residents sharing ideas, after-school programs for kids, support groups for parents, and even a proposal for a mentorship initiative pairing teenagers with local professionals. Each suggestion was met with enthusiasm, and by the end of the evening, the mood had shifted from skepticism to cautious optimism. As Edward walked home that night, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. These centers weren't just about providing resources. They were about empowering people to create their own futures. And Brixton was already proving to be a community eager to rise to the challenge. The construction of the Brixton Center moved swiftly, thanks to the lessons learned from Camden and Southwark. Volunteers from both existing centers came to lend a hand, creating a ripple effect of goodwill that spread across the city. Families who had once been recipients of aid were now giving back, eager to help others find the same hope they had discovered. Amelia, ever the creative force, visited the site one afternoon with her sketchbook in hand. She wandered through the half-built structure, her eyes lighting up as she imagined the possibilities. Mr. Edward, she called, running up to him. I have an idea for the new center. Edward crouched down to her level. Let's hear it. She opened her sketchbook to a drawing of a tree, its roots intertwined with words like community and kindness, and its branches reaching up toward a sun-labeled opportunity. We could paint this on the wall in the main room, Amelia explained, so everyone knows what the center is about. Edward smiled, touched by her thoughtfulness. That's a wonderful idea, Amelia. I'll make sure it happens. The day of the Brixton Center's grand opening arrived faster than anyone had anticipated. The building, once a neglected warehouse, now stood as a beacon of hope. Bright murals covered the walls, and the interior was filled with light, laughter, and the buzz of anticipation. Edward arrived early, as always, to ensure everything was ready. He found Angela overseeing the final preparations with her usual efficiency. You nervous? She asked, handing him a clipboard. A little, Edward admitted, but mostly excited. This feels different, Angela smirked. It's because this isn't just a center anymore. It's a movement. As families began to arrive, the center came alive with activity. Local musicians played outside, children explored the new play areas, and volunteers handed out flyers detailing upcoming programs. Edward stood near the entrance, greeting attendees and soaking in the atmosphere. Peter, the longtime Brixton resident who had voiced his doubts at the initial meeting, approached Edward with a warm smile. You've done good here, Peter said, extending a hand. I was wrong to doubt you. Edward shook his hand firmly. You had every right to be cautious. This only works because people like you believed in it. As the crowd gathered in the communal area, Edward stepped onto a small stage to say a few words. Behind him, Amelia's mural of the tree stood proudly, a visual reminder of the center's mission. This center is proof of what we can achieve when we come together, Edward began. It's not just a place, it's a promise. A promise that no matter where we come from, we all deserve a chance to grow, to thrive, and to belong. Thank you for making this dream a reality. The applause that followed was deafening. Edward looked out at the crowd, his heart swelling with gratitude and pride. This wasn't just his vision anymore. It belonged to everyone in that room. The ripple effect of the centers continued to spread. Inspired by their success, other neighborhoods began reaching out, asking how they could replicate the model. Edward and his team worked tirelessly to create a guidebook, a blueprint that outlined the principles and practices that had made the centers thrive. They called it the Together Framework. One evening, as Edward was reviewing the latest draft of the guidebook, he received a call from Rachel. "You'll want to hear this," she said, her excitement palpable. "I just got off the phone with the foundation in Manchester. They want to start a center there using our framework." Edward leaned back in his chair, a smile spreading across his face. "That's incredible. This is exactly what we hoped for." The Manchester Center was just the beginning. Over the following months, inquiries poured in from cities across the UK. Edward found himself traveling frequently, meeting with community leaders and sharing the story of Camden, Southwark, and Brixton. Despite the hectic schedule, Edward always made time to return to the original centers. They were his grounding force, a reminder of why he had started this journey in the first place. One evening, back at the Camden Center, Amelia approached Edward with her ever-present sketchbook. "Mr. Edward," she said, flipping to a new page, "do you think we could make centers like these in every city?" Edward looked at her drawing, a map of the UK covered in tiny stars, each one labeled with a city's name. "I think we can try," he said, his voice full of conviction. "And with people like you, I know we'll get there." As he walked home that night, Edward felt the weight of the journey ahead. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But there would also be moments like this, moments of hope, connection, and the unshakable belief that together, they could change the world. Edward stepped off the train in Manchester, his bag slung over his shoulder, and took in the sight of the industrial city. Its blend of modern skyscrapers and remnants of its industrial past mirrored the kind of transformation he envisioned for its newest community center. The city's leaders had invited him to share the framework that had brought success to Camden, Southwark, and Brixton, hoping to replicate it in their own struggling neighborhoods. The enthusiasm of the organizers was palpable, but Edward felt the weight of their expectations pressing on him. As he walked toward the town hall, where the first meeting was to take place, he rehearsed his points, determined to make a compelling case for the center's importance. Inside the hall, a crowd of community members, local business leaders, and volunteers filled the rows of chairs. Edward was introduced by a local official, and as he stepped up to the podium, he saw a mixture of curiosity and skepticism in their faces. It was a look he had grown familiar with, and he welcomed the challenge. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak, his voice steady but passionate. He shared stories of families from Camden who had found stability, of teenagers in Brixton who had discovered their talents, and of volunteers in Southwark who had found a renewed sense of purpose through giving back. He painted a vivid picture of what was possible when communities came together, emphasizing that the centers were not just about providing aid but about building lasting connections. The room remained quiet for a moment after he finished, and Edward braced himself for questions. A woman in the front row raised her hand, her expression cautious. "These are beautiful stories, but how do we know it will work here? Manchester isn't London, and our challenges are different." Edward nodded, acknowledging her point. "You're absolutely right," he replied. "Every community is unique, and that's why the people who live here will shape this center. What I'm offering isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. It's a framework, a foundation. The real success comes from your voices, your ideas, and your commitment." His response seemed to resonate, and the energy in the room shifted as more questions followed, this time with genuine curiosity and hope. By the end of the meeting, Edward felt a cautious optimism. Several attendees stayed behind to introduce themselves and express their support, including a man named James, who ran a local youth organization. "If you're serious about this," James said, "I'd love to be involved. Our kids need something like this, a place where they can feel safe and seen." Edward shook his hand firmly. "That's exactly what we want to create," he said, As he left the hall that evening, Edward felt a familiar pull of possibility. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but he had learned to trust the process. The following weeks were a whirlwind of planning and coordination. Edward worked closely with James and other local leaders, holding listening sessions to gather input from the community. He visited schools, talked to parents, and even met with city officials to secure a location for the center. They eventually settled on an old factory building near the city center, its brick walls and high ceilings offering both a challenge and an opportunity. As renovations began, Edward split his time between Manchester and the existing centers in London, ensuring that none of the progress they had made was lost. The travel was exhausting, but the support of his team kept him grounded. However, just as things seemed to be moving smoothly, a new obstacle emerged. One of the primary funders for the Manchester project unexpectedly pulled out, citing internal financial issues. The news hit Edward hard, threatening to derail months of work. He called an emergency meeting with his team to discuss their options. Angela, ever the pragmatist, didn't mince words. "We've been through worse," she said. "If we could survive the funding crisis in Camden, we can survive this." Rachel chimed in, suggesting they leverage the momentum from the existing centers to launch a crowdfunding campaign. Edward agreed, knowing they needed to act quickly. The campaign launched within days, with videos showcasing the impact of the centers and testimonials from families whose lives had been transformed. Amelia's artwork once again became a centerpiece, her colorful cityscapes and hopeful messages striking a chord with viewers. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in not just from Manchester but from across the country, and within weeks, they had raised enough to cover the shortfall. Edward was reminded once again of the power of community and the importance of resilience in the face of challenges. As the Manchester Centre neared completion, Edward made a point to spend more time with the people who would soon call it their own. He visited James's youth organization, sitting in on a mentorship session where older teens shared advice with younger ones. He attended a community potluck, tasting dishes from every corner of Manchester's diverse population. Each interaction deepened his understanding of the city and its people, reaffirming his belief in the work they were doing. On the day of the Manchester Centre's grand opening, Edward stood outside the newly renovated building, watching as families and volunteers streamed in. The walls were adorned with murals, painted by local artists, and the interior buzzed with energy as visitors explored the new space. James greeted Edward with a wide smile. "You've done it," he said. "This place is going to change lives." Edward smiled back, his heart swelling with pride. "We've done it," he corrected. "This is just the beginning." The opening ceremony was simple but heartfelt. Edward once again took the stage, his words carrying the weight of experience and gratitude. He spoke of the challenges they had faced, the people who had made it possible, and the promise of what was yet to come. As the audience applauded, Edward felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just another center. It was a testament to the idea that no obstacle was insurmountable when people came together with a shared purpose. As the evening wound down, Edward found himself standing in front of a new mural that had been unveiled during the ceremony. It was a sprawling depiction of Manchester's skyline, with the community center at its heart. Above it were the words, "Together we thrive." Amelia, who had traveled from London with her mother for the event, stood beside him, holding her sketchbook. "I think we're doing something pretty amazing," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. Edward chuckled. "I think you're right, Amelia." Later that night, as Edward rode the train back to London, he reflected on the journey so far. Each center, each challenge, and each success had taught him something new, not just about others but about himself. He opened his notebook and wrote a single line. "The ripples we create can reach farther than we ever imagine." Edward stood in the middle of the Camden Community Center, watching as families bustled around in preparation for the center's 5-year anniversary celebration. The space was alive with color, music, and laughter, a far cry from the quiet, cautious beginnings of this journey. He could hardly believe how much had changed in such a short time. What had started as a single initiative had grown into a network of centers across the UK, each one a beacon of hope for its community. Amelia, now 13 and taller than Edward remembered, was leading a group of children in decorating the walls with fresh artwork. She had become somewhat of a local celebrity, her murals gracing the walls of nearly every center in the network. Her latest piece, a vivid depiction of interconnected hands forming a tree, was being hung in the main hall as Edward approached her. "You've outdone yourself this time, Amelia," Edward said, admiring the mural. She turned to him with a bright smile. "It's about all of us. Each hand is someone who helped build these centers. I wanted to show how we're all connected." Edward nodded, his chest swelling with pride. "You've captured that perfectly." As the festivities began, Edward mingled with the crowd, exchanging stories and catching up with old friends. Angela stood near the refreshments table, chatting with Henry, who had recently retired from his role as Camden's coordinator. Rachel was organizing a group of volunteers, her energy as boundless as ever. These were the people who had made the impossible possible, and Edward felt a deep gratitude for each of them. The highlight of the evening was a series of speeches from families whose lives had been transformed by the centers. Sarah, one of the first people Edward had helped, took the stage with her 2 children by her side. Her voice trembled with emotion as she recounted how the center had given her a second chance when she thought all hope was lost. "I went from feeling invisible to feeling seen, from surviving to thriving," she said. "And it's not just me. It's everyone here. These centers aren't just buildings, they're homes and their families." The room erupted in applause as Sarah stepped down, and Edward felt a lump in his throat. This was why he had started it all, not for recognition or accolades, but for moments like these, moments when the impact of their work became undeniable. As the night wore on, Edward found a quiet corner to reflect. The centers had become a movement, their influence stretching far beyond what he had initially imagined. New locations were opening every year, each one shaped by the unique needs of its community. The framework they had developed was now being adopted internationally, with inquiries coming from cities as far away as Dublin and Barcelona. Yet, despite the scale of their success, Edward remained grounded. He knew that the heart of the work lay not in expansion, but in the everyday connections being formed within the centers. It was in the laughter of children learning to read, the determination of a parent mastering a new skill, and the quiet confidence of someone finding their place in the world. Angela joined him, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "Hiding from the party," she teased, handing him one. "Just taking it all in," Edward replied, a small smile playing on his lips. Angela leaned against the wall, her gaze sweeping over the room. "You've built something incredible, Edward. Something that's going to outlast all of us." He shook his head. "We've built it, Angela. None of this would exist without you, Rachel, Henry, and everyone else who believed in it." Angela smirked. "Fine, we'll share the credit. But seriously, you should be proud." "I am," Edward admitted. "But there's still so much to do." "There always will be," Angela said. "That's the point, isn't it? This work never really ends." Edward nodded, her words settling deeply within him. The centers were not a solution to every problem, but they were a step in the right direction. A reminder that change was possible, one connection at a time. As the celebration wound down, Amelia approached Edward with her sketchbook. "I made one more thing for tonight," she said, flipping to a page filled with bold strokes of color. The drawing depicted a bridge stretching across a vast river, its foundation built on intertwined hands. Above it were the words, Together, we build futures. Edward stared at the drawing, moved beyond words. It's perfect, Amelia. Thank you. You're welcome, she said, her eyes shining with pride. It's for you, so you never forget what you've done. I won't, Edward promised. And I'll make sure the world doesn't either. The next morning, Edward returned to his penthouse overlooking the Thames, a space that now felt more like a place to rest than a home. His real home, he realized, was out there, in the centers, in the communities, in the lives they were changing. He sat by the window, the city stretching out before him, and opened the leather-bound notebook he had carried with him since the beginning. Flipping through its pages, he revisited the notes he had made over the years, dreams, challenges, and moments of triumph. On the last page he wrote, "The work continues, because hope never ends." Edward closed the notebook, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready for it. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he wouldn't face them alone. Together, they would keep building, one connection, one story, and one life at a time.